And also the certain defects can be because of the technical debts, right? Like not necessarily from the requirements point of view, but like from the architecture and design point of view that needs to be addressed as well, especially when you're moving to new system or cloud or new technologies.
Well, talking about requirements, I mean, you can have your test cases as requirements as well. Well, imagine having defects in the test cases.
That's easy though. I mean, because, well, not easy, but a common defect in the test case you get, especially with newer teams, is they run the test, right? And running the test is a sign of testing, but they don't actually do anything with the results they get out of the test other than say, hey, we ran the test.
This is why the real test of testing is making sure that I have ownership of the outcomes. That you don't get quality unless I also carry the pager.
True statement.
I mean, if I don't feel it, if I stub my toe, why shouldn't I stub my toe? It's fine.
Hey everyone, gonna live stream the last half hour of our discussion here back onto YouTube. This is an amazing conversation. I want to make sure also everyone saw the last question, which was how can we use test-driven development to help improve quality?
Oh God, don't panic again. That's why I didn't see that one. Back to Pong.
You've been playing Pong a lot here, Tracy.
Here it is.
Keep refreshing. Sorry about that. Yeah,
that's okay.
You're not alone, Tracy. I'm with you there.
Sorry about that, Gotham. Interesting. So TDD results in testable code. Testing a forethought rather than an afterthought. TD helps with quality of each functionality. Brings tests closer to the code by being written in a similar language. This is all very interesting. Anybody care to expand?
Yeah, sure. I can tell you from my experience when I managed a QA team that we were doing automation in a different language than the developers were, and they just didn't want to touch, they didn't even want to look at the test because they were like, oh, I'm not learning a new language. And what happened was that the automation engineers that would write the code, they would wait till the feature was actually mature enough because it would change very often during coding. And so best case scenario, we would have automated tests written a sprint after the feature was actually released, which was kind of a bummer. And when we introduced TDD, everyone was super excited because it was part of the Git code. So it was in the same sprint, it was in the same language, and therefore developers could both participate or at least debug or do a code review for the automation engineers writing the code. So it just made it so much closer to them and faster and part of the sprint and part of the DoD.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I tried TDD and in fact, for traditional teams, it can be quite a cultural change. But if you're able to implement it correctly, it gives you, quick benefits. In fact, it drives your design, improves your design.
Yeah,
Those things.
I was actually talking to a team where they had hired a tester, which was already painful, but they'd hired a tester and they wanted to bring in a framework that used Python as the code, and the entire team coded in Java. And I said, okay, well, you're going to increase the complexity of your team stack. The team won't be able to support the testing. That particular tester may go away, and that was his preferred framework. I would tell him no.
If you're used to writing code first and then testing, it's very hard to kind of think that. Let's imagine about the testing first. What kind of test case I write and make them fail, and it's a different way of thinking.
I know there was something that changed in the industry when I started, because back when I started, I was responsible. I mean, I actually had to deliver working things.
I think that's a fair comment. And I've seen the productivity go down if the framework is in some other language. Actually, it introduces issues. I mean, going even after TDD, if the focus is not more on the end-to-end testing, we do see issues. So you have the sprints and the Scrum teams performing extremely well, but when it comes to integration, when it comes to end-to-end tests, so I think TDD has to be expanded a bit to look at the overall end-to-end testing as well. And I think then the efficiency really improves.
Yeah, I mean, I think of TDD, I usually think about a small component, like it doesn't require any kind of integration. Like that's what I think about TDD. When I start thinking about bigger things like end to end, that typically, moves, in my opinion, out of the realm of TDD and start thinking about behaviors of the system. And maybe you start coupling some behaviors together to pull those in. But you just got to be careful that TDD doesn't require, 5 external dependencies, or if you kind of, you've made it too complex.
Sure, yeah. So it's fine with yes, with a certain component, but when it goes to a kind of a polyglot environment, I think we should think a little bit broader. So that was the point there. So you have a team, developing code. Typically, a microservice kind of an environment, and then if we try to bring in a framework which is very, very particular with one kind of a language, then it introduces some issues.
Yeah, I like to think of a framework as really lightweight. What do I need to provide the proof that I've tested? Typically, there's a book of record. Like, give me the minimal rails to ride on or paved road to drive on. Don't force a particular technology on me. Just like give me some services, some API calls, so I can send my test results. That type of thing. I think the old way of thinking is definitely like you guys are saying, some of the pain points is heavy. VB script, Java type of framework. I think that just doesn't really lend itself to a team owning that. If they're writing an application in React, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Also, they should start writing the test before they start the coding, right? Like, so when they see if it fails, then they start developing the code. It'll be easy for them to test the functionality, especially around the unit testing. So,
Sachin, I see you and I are 100% aligned. We answered the same question the same way. That's awesome. Makes me feel good.
Another question has come in. Should you stop doing manual testing after test cases have been automated? Felipe, you say it depends on how stable is the use case. You want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, because if it does not change, you do not have to change the functionality of the testing. But if it changes, you have to create probably a new functionality or new behavior or a new coding to that case. So it depends.
Gotcha.
Yeah, CrowdChat's really unstable.
Too many good answers coming through, Brian. Mark, you brought up toil with this last question. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, right. Isn't that the point of automate?
Yep.
If you have to do it more than once, it needs to be automated. Once you start having a test that shows current value, you automate it. But that doesn't mean you stop thinking about new tests or new ways to split it. It becomes part of your telemetry everywhere.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's the key, actually. Whatever needs to be done on a repeated basis must be automated. But there are things we need to do, once, or there are things which you can't really automate. And a lot of folks are talking about experience testing, for example, user experience.
I would say if we're not automating it, we're not thinking hard enough. Or the technology hasn't caught up to us yet.
Yeah, I was going to add that, Mark, saying probably at this point, we don't have enough sophisticated technology to mimic human behavior to the extent that we would like.
Yeah, you're talking about the behavioral driven development, right? BDD.
Well,
Not
I mean,
behavior, but
if
you
you're-
know,
We're talking about user experience, human experience. I
Yeah.
don't think that there will ever be a technology which can mimic human experience. Humans will always be humans, right?
I don't know, man. AI ML is catching up.
I'll
But
say,
who is making it catch up? Humans only, right?
Yeah.
I have to work from the security side a lot, and I find that a lot of that compliance stuff, we're too good at doing the vulnerability and too bad at doing the other half of the compliance bit. And we're not working hard enough at automating those things to produce the artifacts to make things compliant with outside regulations.
Yeah, that's a hard domain, I think. It's pretty complex to automate. But
It takes a lot
nowadays-
of time, takes a lot of users, which makes it more important to automate, not less.
Yeah, a lot of next-gen frameworks are coming, AI-based testing frameworks, which can probably be useful here.
yeah, I did an exercise one time with an area where I grabbed some of my old team's code that had not been coded with TDD, showed how terrifying it was to refactor it so it was testable, and uncovered a production defect and opened a ticket on my old team. And said, now stop writing code without tests.
I mean, the other thing where you know we talked about like some of the compliance testing, some of those harder areas to test. You know, when like this is where things like inner sourcing comes into play. Like if there's a common problem that tries to be solved, I think you know crowdsourcing that across the organization and being okay. It's I mean sort of what you said, Brian, made me think about that. It was your old team, not your existing team. So you looked at their code and submitted a PR back that way. So I think that's probably a critical part to really moving the needle in a cultural way of everyone owning quality and everyone kind of contributing to the greater good.
Felipe, you just posed a question. Would you like to read it to the group?
Yeah, when we talk about continuous testing, it's not just about testing the software or the piece of software that you are creating to. It's about to test the whole process end to end, because what happens if you put that piece of software into production and it does not work, not because the software is not working, but because a dependency is not working in the right way. So testing is, when you talk about testing, you have to talk about testing the whole process end to end.
Totally agree, Felipe. I was actually answering to your tweet, but
Me too.
it's more around continuous testing of the entire value stream and not just the development portion of things. I think that's a valuable distinction that a lot of organizations forget because they think it's just the development portion that requires testing, more from a traditional viewpoint.
Now, I frequently get teams that have environment-specific branches. I'm trying to explain to them that they're not even testing the same artifact, much less the entire flow.
So Felipe, you mean to say the part which is done manually as well? I mean, because any system we would have software code running, but there could be a lot of manual processes running around that, testing that part as well. Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Yeah, what
Right.
Felipe,
We are talking about the value stream, the whole value stream, end to end.
Yeah.
We cannot talk about just testing a piece of the software or the application that you are building in that moment.
Okay, good thought. Yeah.
What happens if if that piece does not work regarding dependencies with other pieces of software.
Agree.
Yeah, that reminds me, Felipe. I was working with a organization once. I was working in the QA organization. They had an automated framework. So I was like, okay, show me your unit test. Show me where your code coverage. Let's see your how are you testing your framework? So where we landed was, we're not putting the Q and SQA, the quality and SQA. So it's really hard to go out and push a framework on folks when your house is not in order. So first thing we did was started scanning with SonarQube and failing builds on unit test and writing unit test, and then making sure the automated testing framework was testing itself, the shared steps and things like that. Same thing with the pipeline. If you're on a centralized team and pushing a DevOps pipeline, you ought to be writing unit tests. Your pipeline ought to be testing. So we did the same thing with the pipeline team. Like you can't push one envelope if you're not doing it yourself. So I'm glad you posted. That was really good.
So while you were on the transition phase, how did you manage the velocity of your projects? That might have got impacted, right?
Oh, when we introduced unit testing, when we hadn't been testing.
Yeah, writing the automation, introducing the SonarQube, and then going back and fixing it. That would have been affected your velocity.
Definitely. It's like the thing I say. We're gonna slow down to speed up, right? So we didn't start with 0 to 0 unit test to 80% code coverage. We set the bar low, and then what we did was every sprint we had story points set aside for technical debt. Because that's what it was. It was a big bunch of technical debt. So we said we're going to pay down technical debt, every sprint. So it was a long, slow process, but kind of battled on two fronts. We stopped the bleeding. Said starting today, going forward, we're going to operate this new way of working, and then we have X amount of technical debt to overcome historically.
Got it. With SonarQube, you get the KPIs around the remediation effort, right? You see a defect or code smells, it gives automatically what's going to be the effort. From the developer point of view. So is that really work?
I use that as a loose guide. And I don't get too wrapped up on code coverage percentage, kind of like Brian said, you could gamify that number, but when you did that story points, the dedicated technical debt, we sort of used the SonarQube estimation of time it will take as a guide. So we started at the high critical things and worked down, and we said, we think it's about this many SonarQube issues. If you run out of what we predicted, go grab some more. Otherwise, we'll get to a next sprint type of thing. But that was for technical debt.
Got it.
Yeah, I think we also did something similar, but I think the trap is not to become very pedantic about it, because if there is some part of code which is running for 20 years or whatever, 10 years, it's not giving you any pain, then probably, and if your new enhancements are not touching that piece of the code, if it's not broken, probably there's no need to go and fix it. But definitely from a particular day or a threshold onwards, it's you have 85%, 90%, whatever is the threshold, that's your unit test coverage. But for the technical debt, you may have to really apply some kind of, thought process.
That's actually,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt.
Yeah, so we did a hybrid of whatever Shivagami and Eric are saying. We did the same thing as well. We had to go back a little bit to rewrite some of the requirements and clean up some of the stories out there, because a lot of them were just aspirations that were put in. But what we did with some of the teams is, after we identify that there is technical debt and these are some things we want to improve in the next sprint or iteration or whatever, we used to do a 2x2 matrix to do the impact effort analysis and say which of these really are beneficial for us and we want to tackle for the next iteration with our sprint. So that was something we introduced as well. But I totally agree. You can't, while there's a good aspiration that you want to remove as much of technical debt as possible, if something's not worth tackling or deconstructing at that point, probably not touch it.
Yeah, but critical issues, blockers are, need to be removed everywhere.
Yep.
But low severity ones, yeah, you can take a call. And but just going back to what Felipe spoke about, right? We've had a lot of experience on that, and I think what it also means is when we make a change to a service, it's about understanding the impact of that change on any of the other services that are consuming this service. I think that's where we had a problem. So there is this service, and because we didn't have a very good service catalog or whatever, the impact that would have on the multiple other systems. So the dependency management and that kind of testing, I mean, obviously for your application it works fine, but because it was being consumed by a lot more people, there would be people who would come and say, oh, this is broken, that's broken. That I think is something that we have to include in the end-to-end testing to understand, to have a dependency map of what our application has an implication on other services, and then do a end-to-end service, or you publish a changed API version number, catalog. You just need to bring everybody together.
Right.
And
Right.
that requires more testing. Yeah.
I agree with that.
Well, thank you, Shivagami, for bringing that up, because this is Tracy, and I'm super passionate about configuration management, and that's what the Ortelius project is all about. So if there's anybody out there who wants to be part of an open source effort to solve that particular problem, bring configuration management back into the conversation, which is super critical for testing. If we don't know what changes, we have to test monolithic. Microservices won't allow us to do that. So we have to start understanding what the application, from a logical view, what it looks like and how it's being impacted all the time. Because a microservice can be updated and impact 10 applications. How are we doing that? Are we going to retest them all? We should. Got to be able to tell a CD pipeline to go retest them all, because we can't think through it manually.
Yeah. Well said.
Once you have the configuration management in place and you move from monolithic to microservice, the transition becomes easy. Otherwise, it's
so much easier. And I talk about this oftentimes with people who think that continuous delivery is something new and that we're figuring it out from the beginning, but it's not necessarily true. If we look at our past and our history, and we look at the mainframe has this stuff down pretty well. Products like Endeavor and ChangeMan, they automated just about everything, and you could automate testing with it. But what both of those tools had in common was automated configuration management. ACM was part of that, their delivery pipeline, and they relied on it to determine if a new library was released out, who was impacted, and they would go and make sure that all of that was updated and tested. So we have arrived to a point in time where in testing, configuration management and SCM in general should be a renewed conversation, because we've forgotten it.
What about contract-based testing? When I think about microservices, that's where my mind goes first. I'm building a service and I have multiple consumers. I'm going to support N-2 releases, and I'm going to have a contract and a service catalog. I think Brian and I had a recent chat about contract-based testing, but that's when I think about microservices. That's where my head kind of goes.
Yeah, so you have to keep in mind, in a monolithic world, what we do is we do a compile and we do a link. And when we do contract testing, we as an application team know that we're going to link that in. We're aware of it. Now in microservices, we're compiling. If we're using a compiled code, Python doesn't even compile. We create a container image, and then the linking is done at runtime. So you may have a new version of a microservice that your application consumes, and you don't even know you're using the new version of it. So while contract testing is critical and it's important, it's just changing because the application, the microservice developer doesn't necessarily know who's decided to consume their microservice, because it's not linked statically, it's linked dynamically.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely get where you're going. I typically try to avoid, using latest tags and things like that, so I can control the versions I get. So I'm less surprised. I mean, you still get breaking changes, but I can control my surprise a little bit more than
Yeah, I think solving the problem, because right now it requires discipline. Discipline falls apart. Sorry. So how do you solve the problem of discipline? I mean, Pact and tools like that work, but only for specific use cases, right? So how can you solve discipline at the enterprise level so people just can't break contracts?
Sometimes,
Yeah, I don't have an answer either.
You have to automate as much as you can. You have to allow people to collaborate. People need to know who's consuming their microservices. You have to be able to have a way to follow a microservice. There's got to be collaboration, and we talk about observability. Observability I see as a part of the performance monitoring and what's happening. But what about before it ever gets out there? We need a way to be able to visualize how applications are being constructed, even though they're going to be dynamically put together at runtime.
Yeah, I agree with that, Tracy. I sort of think about like observability has a prerequisite to even thinking about stepping into microservice, because the game's changing on you. Instead of one massive log file you're looking at, now you have, if you have 20 microservices, 20 different logs. So like you got to have some way to trace the flow through your system. Otherwise, like you're going to be debugging and trying to figure it out forever.
There's
At every cluster.
Yeah, I was talking to a team a while back, a couple of years ago, and they went to a conference and learned all about microservices. And they couldn't operate the thing that they had, but they were going to decompose it into microservices because those are better, right?
Well, they are, but we have to change.
They are if you understand how to operate. Right?
Well,
I think operate your monolith. You're not going to be able to operate microservices.
Yeah, a lot of times on that one, Brian, like I kind of guard against that by asking the question, what are you hoping microservices solves for you? Because like you guys know BDD and TDD, we've talked about that, but oftentimes what I find with someone pushing microservice and they can't answer why, they're introducing a new pattern I call RDD. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but it's called resume-driven development.
Yeah, exactly. And conference-driven development. And I can't tell you how many teams I've talked to that they've already done, they've already started breaking things up to microservices, but they don't know DDD. And when you go look at when they go draw a context diagram, they just have a distributed monolith, right?
Yeah. So Brian, interesting about, you spoke about tagging. The point is, and the discipline around it. So it's true, but we have not evolved ourselves into purely independent services, right? So even if you want to tag, and if tagging is going to help to some extent when we're talking about integration, what really happens is a service is not so very independent and immutable. It does have, like the database connections and things like that, and these changes are the ones that really impact, like Philippi spoke about. So yeah, it is evolving. Configuration management really is going to help in a big manner, but also the entire discipline of how we architect a service is going to matter as well.
We have a lot of interesting discussions coming up. I know that. We're all learning and we're all figuring it out, and I think it's a fascinating time to be in software.
Tracy, I think one of the challenges you mentioned when you talk configuration management is when you talk to outside people and you say that, they think that the configuration should drive it. And instead, what you're offering with microservices is just like I think Vishnu said, an observability, right? An awareness of what happens so that you can know how your change affects the overall system rather than you control a change within the system.
Right. Knowledge is power, right?
But you hear configuration management. Every time you hear configuration managers, well, they're going to control what you do with your system. And that's not really what you want. You want an awareness.
Yes.
For example, one of the things we need to consider when we are talking about testing, for example, is to test the rollback process. For example, because when you think about technology, you need to think that something can go wrong. So testing the rollback, it's key in the process to guarantee an uptime and a fast way to put the service again in the right way.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you can't test your rollback, what's the point of designing a rollback which doesn't work when your production system is broken?
Very good point. Yeah.
But the roadmap is only as good as your next gas station, right? If you're not willing to throw it out, change directions at that point,
Yeah.
too committed. Your tests are only as good as they get you good data, and then you throw out your tests and you come up with new ones.
Right.
You know, I was talking to Mike Nygaard, and he had this great test that he added to a pipeline once. That if the pipeline, this was for CI, if it took more than 15 minutes, the build would fail.
Yeah, you've left the realm of CI at that point, in my opinion.
Well, I agree, but it was an outside bounds, right? And so it just, you know, it was just a forcing function on refactoring the tests.
Yeah, yeah. No, and like there are going to be some systems that take a long time, like, you know, like a deep security test. So, you know, I just personally, I've found it's better to move the gating from CI to CD at that point, just because it's like it reminds you of you know, going on a trip with your kids in the backseat. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? So I'd rather get the feedback to the team, you know, as quick as I can. So, but yeah, I definitely get your point there, Brian.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. We got just a minute or so left. Happy to continue this conversation for a few more minutes if you want to stick around. Real quick, any of your favorite learning resources on continuous testing as we head into the next Skill Up Day on November 19th?
I don't offer continuous testing, but I do have to say that there's a lot of good resources out there. There's a website called microservices.io that covers things like domain-driven design and how important that is. And that's Chris Richardson, Cloud Foundry fame. His material is really spot on. I think he's doing a great job in defining microservices and how it's changing our world.
I've got a heavy monolithic VB script if anyone's interested. Totally kidding. Not a sales pitch, it was a joke.
We all do. We all do. That's the problem.
Very good. Very good. Any final closing thoughts from anybody? Any additional takeaways from this discussion? Anything else that we should look to towards in the future?
This was a lot of fun. I learned a lot from you folks today, so I had a good time joining you.
It was
very interesting to listen to all the diverse, contrasting thoughts, and you can only go back more knowledgeable and wise.
It was very stimulating, especially when you're toggling between Zoom conversations and your Crowdcast conversation. It was awesome.
Yeah, it's like a fire hose. It's hard to keep track.
Yeah, it certainly is a fire hose. Thanks for everyone for hanging in there. Yeah, I learned a lot. I always learn a lot personally during these crowd chats. So I want to say thanks again for joining and really appreciate your time. And any other final closing thoughts before we close it up for the day?
Everybody should be signed up already, but the all-day DevOps is tomorrow. If you haven't seen that set of announcements go out. Free conferences, 24 hours of presentations.
Yeah, I got to do a final run on mine to make sure I'm under 30 minutes.
And make sure that everyone is already signed up for Skill Up Day continuous testing next week and Global Skill Up Fest in December.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Ciao.
Ciao.